corn is very important in all the animal production. But in a feedlot perspective, the majority of the feedlot in the US and also in Brazil use corn grain as their main source of starch, which is the most energetic nutrient in the diet. And the majority of the feedlots use corn silage as their roughage, and not to mention the various corn industry byproducts that are used in the feedlot industry. So that makes corn very important, a big driver in the cost of feeding these animals, and especially in an industry that has such narrow margins.
Welcome to the Beef Podcast Show, brought to you by Wisenetics. I'm Dr. AJ Tarpoff, and we are dedicated to bringing you the latest insight and discussions from the cattle industry. So sit back, relax, and get ready to expand your knowledge with today's episode. And today's episode is going to be another great one. We get to talk about an awesome topic, which is feeding feedlot cattle, one of my favorite topics. Our guest today, Dr. Ludmila Monteiro. She is a postdoc at Kansas State University. So she's originally from Brazil, correct? Okay, did her master's degree at University of Sao Paulo, did her PhD at Kansas State University. Her research has been focusing on feedlot nutrition, in vitro ruminal fermentation, feed ingredients and additives, as well as grain processing. So with that, Ludmila, welcome to the Beef Podcast Show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Now, that's kind of a brief intro for you. I really want to ask you, tell us a little bit more about yourself, kind of your progression through the cattle industry, and a little bit more about what you're doing today.
Well, growing up, I had a lot of contact with the rural environment, mainly because of my dad's job. He was an agronomist working with pine tree forests. So, but I never had to work in the farm. And then I decided to study animal science because I wanted to work in the nature and I wanted to have contact with animals. And then my interest in ruminal nutrition started during the beginning of my undergraduate program, when I got involved with ruminal nutrition group, which has like a company's responsibilities. And during that time, I had the opportunity to grow not only as a student, learning the science of ruminal nutrition, but also as a young professional. And then when I finished my undergraduate program, I started working as a feed seller, mainly for beef and dairy cattle operations. And I worked there for about a year. And it was a great experience. I got to learn so much from the producers and from the feed company. And at that time, I already knew that I wanted to do a master's and then that I wanted to do a PhD abroad. So I started my master's in a different university that I did my undergraduate program, but both of the universities are in the state of São Paulo in Brazil. And during my master's, I worked with a group that studies beef and dairy nutrition. So I got to contribute to the group's dairy research, which is pasture-based. And the studies that were part of my thesis were in feedlot nutrition. And I focused on fiber-lipid enzymes and types and level of roughage in the diet. And then after that, I moved to Kansas to work on my PhD. Right now, I'm a postdoc researcher. And today, I want to talk a bit about part of my research at K-State.
No, that's perfect. And it's nice that you're here, and nice to be at K-State, and it's nice to talk to another fellow K-Stater. So I appreciate that. That'll be a lot of fun.
Is stress affecting your bottom line? Even routine handling, inclement weather, weaning, and dietary changes can significantly lower the rumen pH, causing cortisol levels to spike. Cortisol not only compromises the immune system, but also suppresses normal appetite and feed consumption. The solution? Cattle Active. Increase production and reduce the impacts of stress on your cattle for cents a day. Cattle Active restores the balance naturally. Want to learn more how a feeding program including Cattle Active can improve both profits and herd health? Visit us today at proearthanimalhealth.com. Be proactive with Cattle Active.
So let's dive into some of the research that you've done, but let's start up, our conversation is going to focus mostly about corn. So let's talk about corn as a nutritional component of our feedlot diets. What makes corn so special? What makes it so great for our feedlot nutrition?
Yeah, well, corn is very important in all the animal production. But in a feedlot perspective, the majority of the feedlot in the US and also in Brazil use corn grain as their main source of starch, which is the most energetic nutrient in the diet. And the majority of the feedlots use corn silage as their roughage, and not to mention the various corn industry byproducts that are used in the feedlot industry. So that makes corn a very important, a big driver in the cost of feeding these animals, and especially in an industry that has such narrow margins. With that, we need to improve the use of this nutrient, of the starch in the diet, whether by maximizing its energetic potential or by maximizing and decreasing costs, actually, of processing and handling that grain.
Now, when I look at the United States and North America, as we go in different regions, sometimes the corn production isn't quite as high as other locations it's all about the starch. And we go deep south areas in southern locations that might use a little bit more sorghum. We go up further north and we might use things that are short day growing seasons like barley. But at the end of the day, corn is the standard. Right? Corn is kind of the gold standard that we base everything else off of in feedlot nutrition. Now, with your experience in Brazil, do they have a wide variety of some of that feedlot use? Is it just corn, or do they also have some sorghum inclusion, wheat inclusion, barley inclusion? Are there any other grains that are utilized in that location?
Yes, in Brazil, most of the starch source is corn, but they also use a little bit of sorghum, barley, little bit of wheat, but mainly corn, just like in the US. The difference is that the corn used in Brazil is the flint type, which is less digestible than the dent corn used in the US.
No, that's interesting. And that's something that I wasn't really aware of, but it does make sense. I guess, if we're going to maximize corn capabilities in our feedlot diets, you talked about economics, and it's important that we need to make every dime, every dollar, every bit count. I guess, how do we maximize the availability of the starch in our feedlot rations? Because that corn, I hear it from ranchers all the time. If they feed whole corn, they see it come out the back end. I guess, how do we make sure that most of that energy stays inside the growing steer?
Yes. So when we talk about maximizing the use, we mostly want to improve the digestibility of the corn. And we have to talk about the digestibility of the starch, because starch makes up to 70% of the corn kernel. And some of the things that influence its digestibility can be intake level, which in the feedlot is high, the duration that the corn stays in the rumen. So as you mentioned, using whole corn, it usually stays very little in the rumen and then it passes by. And then we can also improve the accessibility of the microorganisms and the enzymes that will break down the starch. And to improve that accessibility, we must process the corn. And for that, we have different alternatives of processing. And but we can also make use of exogenous enzymes and feed additives to that diet. And the ways to process the corn, the most common ways are simply dry rolling corn, which will improve the surface area and expose the corn endosperm to the microbes and the enzymes. We can also harvest high moisture corn and then grind it and ensile it. With that, there will be fermentation going on, and we're going to also solubilize the protein matrix that involves the corn grain, and we're going to make that high moisture corn even more accessible to enzymes and microbes. And we can also, which is pretty common in Kansas, steam flake corn. And that will change the structure of the starch. There will be gelatinization occurring there by applying heat and moisture. And also we're going to increase the surface area by passing the corn through rolls. And when we talk about digestibility of those processed grain, we're going to have the highest digestibility, total tract digestibility for steam flaked corn, followed by high moisture corn, and then dry rolled corn.
So let's start with that. Because that's always discussed, that we're getting more efficiency. We're getting every time we process it, depending on what type of process, we get more out of it. But on a percentage basis, if we use, whether you want to use dry rolled corn as the standard, I guess if you go from like whole corn to dry rolled corn to high moisture to steam flake, how much more energy do we get out of said corn, or how much more efficiency do we get out of the corn with the various stages of processing? Because at the end of the day, processing comes at a cost. So we have to pay for that cost of getting that efficiency, and hopefully we get it by production. So I guess talk a little bit about what, yes, it's more efficient, but how much more do we gain with those different types of processing?
Yeah, so usually when we process steam flaked corn and high moisture corn, we can get up to 99% of digestibility of that corn. And when we compare to dry rolled corn, we get like 91, 92%. That's a huge difference when we make the math and how much that corn became meat and fat in the animal. That's the big driver. So we must process corn, and we know that it's not always possible. It depends on the size of the operations, the location of the operations, but if it's possible, we must process the corn.
We can't always expect cattle. They binge feed. They don't always want to grind that grain themselves. And you might hear them chew on some kernels occasionally, but boy, you get to a feedlot steer, they just binge feed, swallow everything, and they chew it a little bit as they chew their cud. But we can't expect cattle to do all the breakdown of those big kernels.
Correct.
So, the cost associated with it. So you mentioned, high moisture. If we have a producer or somebody out there listening to this podcast, yes, there's huge, potential value of processing grain. Crack corn is pretty ubiquitous. We can find that almost everywhere. High moisture. What type of resources does a producer need if they're going to put up high moisture corn to go through that fermentation process? Do they need a pit like a silo? Kind of what do they need? So
they will need to harvest the corn in a certain moisture content, and that sometimes is hard because we depend a lot on the weather. But they're going to have to harvest that corn, and then they're going to have to grind that corn, and then ensile it. So they must have some type of silo. It could be a pit, it could be bags, or a way to store that. And that material will have to stay there for a little while, right? Like maybe at least 30 days. So the producer will have to have some equipment available for that and space as well.
So if they're harvesting their own grain or harvesting that grain relatively close by, they have an option to be able to do something like that. And I guess if they're already used to putting up regular corn silage, it could be a potential to have that starch availability. They could do something pretty similar to be able to get that added gain. So I guess then moving into equipment, and I think this is where the cost comes in, steam flaking. That takes on a whole other bear. That's a whole other different type of almost industry when we start talking about steam flaking, correct?
Correct. That will demand to have a boiler, electricity available, a steam flaking chest, the rollers, and that's very expensive, but it pays out. It depends on the size of the operation, but it pays out because that's when we have the most feed efficiency.
Most companies know AI can help, but the hard part is getting it deployed inside the business. Elevate Agents builds and launches custom AI agents that handle repetitive workflows, reduce manual overhead, and help teams move faster without adding headcount. From identifying the right use cases to deploying agents that actually work in your operations, Elevate turns AI from an idea into execution. Build smarter systems with Elevate Agents. Visit elevateagents.ai.
And it turns into a science. I love working with the mill guys that, they get down to a science and they pull out individual flakes and just start measuring consistency. I love getting into the mill at feed yards, just learning more about that. So that's processing to be able to get a little bit more availability of those starches. But with some of the corn breeding and some of the genetics and things like that, there's some new opportunities there or new availabilities of different things. I keep hearing more and more about high-amylase corn, right? And tell us a little bit about what that is, how it became, because it was really directly tied with the ethanol industry. But we've kind of found a kind of almost a side market for us here in the cattle industry. So tell us a little bit more about, beyond just regular processing, what this high alpha amylase corn, what it is, right?
Right. So for the ethanol industry, when they mix the corn with water to produce that slurry, they have to add an exogenous alpha amylase enzyme. So this company came up with this corn hybrid that has a higher expression, is genetically modified to have higher expression of an alpha amylase enzyme. And that eliminates the need for adding that exogenous enzyme to produce ethanol. And then this corn hybrid was explored in the feeding industry, and with the goal of improving starch digestibility, because that enzyme is one of the enzymes responsible for breaking down starch. So with that, there have been several studies analyzing high alpha amylase enzymes, corn hybrid in diets, either in laboratory scale research, performance studies, carcass characteristics, and also utilizing corn as grain or corn silage. And this is part of the research that I have been conducting here at K-State, and I'm glad to talk a little bit about it.
No, please dive into this, because everybody asks if they're going to plant this corn, are there any added benefits, right? So kind of walk through your progression and some of the research that you've done on both on the grain, what some potential added benefits, as well as in the silage. So please dive into some of that, some of the work that you've done to show and tell some of our listeners to be, what are some realistic expectations if you're going to use some of these corn hybrids?
So this corn hybrid is supposed to be exactly the same, nutritionally speaking, as the number 2 yellow corn. The only difference is that it has a higher expression of the alpha amylase enzyme. And we were talking about processing corn, and we have a very interesting study that a colleague of mine conducted in recent years, which they fed finishing steers either dry rolled corn or steam flaked corn. And they showed in their research that the high-amylase dry rolled corn had similar feed efficiency and cost of gain than steam flaked corn, conventional steam flaked corn. This is very interesting, especially for operations that don't have how to extensively process the grain like steam flaking. And in that same research, they also analyzed the cost of steam flaking the high-amylase corn. Because with our studies, we confirmed that the high-amylase corn has more starch availability compared to the conventional corn. And so when we flake that corn, we have to flake it to a higher density compared to the conventional corn. So then they can reach the same starch availability, and then we can compare them. And with that, when we increase the flaking density, we increase the flaking throughput. So it's faster to flake. And also, which is something that is very interesting, is that the high amylase corn cooks way faster than the conventional corn. So doing the analysis of electricity costs, personnel, the boiler, water use, they concluded that steam flaking high amylase corn hybrids cost 17% less than conventional corn.
Well, yes, there's a lot of potential benefits there. I want to back up a little bit to the difference between flake corn and just dry rolled corn with the high alpha amylase to be able to increase that starch availability. So somebody that doesn't have the investment, or a smaller operation that that doesn't want to invest into a huge, steam flake facility and all of those things, can still improve, not just they don't have to change their processing. They can change the corn that they purchase and still have some of those improvements in efficiency.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we can start spreading out some of those efficiencies that, you can start competing at a much bigger level, even on some of those smaller operations.
Correct. Yes. We have been conducting a few trials here throughout this past decade. But another study that I would like to talk about, which is one that I conducted, we fed backgrounding steers and subsequently finishing in the finishing phase, and we wanted to see the performance overall throughout the feedlot phase, growing and finishing phases. So we fed in the growing phase, we fed steers steam flake corn, high amylase or conventional, corn silage, high amylase or conventional. And then in the subsequent phase, in the finishing phase, we fed them the steam flake corn, either high amylase or conventional corn. And we realized that for the overall feed efficiency, steers that were fed high amylase steam flake corn during the growing phase had 4.2% higher feed efficiency than the steers that were fed conventional corn. In that particular study, we didn't see differences for feeding different types of silage during the backgrounding or different types of steam flake corn during the finishing phase. But we have this interesting data about feeding high amylase corn during the backgrounding phase.
Yeah. So yes, you can grow silage out of it, but what you found was, again, the corn starch key component, the energy component of the ration, is really what made some of the bigger differences in efficiency, whether it had high amylase or not. Correct?
Correct.
So I guess it's is this type of corn, is it readily available? If somebody goes to the local co-op, I mean, is it available for regular purchase, or is this something that they have to grow themselves?
I believe that they have to grow themselves. There are some rules for that because we have to avoid cross-contamination between the High-Amylase hybrid with the conventional hybrids. So there's some rules for growing that hybrid. There's also some rules for transportation and storage, all to avoid cross-contamination. So that's where the producers would have to go after for assessing this corn hybrid.
Yeah, well, and it's making a change in efficiency. Maybe today is kind of a harder sell because corn is relatively cheap in the big scheme of things with feeding cattle today. But we all know things go in cycles. So once those feed costs start elevating, that we really want to start putting pressure on improving that feed efficiency. This could be a viable option for somebody to consider with prior planning, that be able to have an opportunity to increase that efficiency, increase that starch availability with less processing inputs. That's all a big positive.
Correct. And as we said, corn grain is the most used starch source in the feeding industry, and in feedlots it can be very high, like above 80% of the diet. So whenever we can find alternatives to decrease costs by either improving the animal use of that nutrient or processing, storing it, they have to go for it.
And I guess I should ask, is there much of a cost difference between a high-amylase corn versus kind of our conventional number 2? Is there much of a dollar difference if somebody was going to buy it, plant it, raise it, anything like that? Or is it pretty similar?
It's pretty similar, the cost of producing.
Well, very good. Well, no, I think it's great to just see some of the technologies that we have available even today that use in different types of genetics. And again, cattle are the ultimate, resource that we get to use stuff from other industries. And even though that this technology, this type of corn was originally developed to help with ethanol production, it's still fermentation. We're still fermenting feed in the rumen of cattle that we can still see some of those added benefits, and it does carry over to our feeding industry.
Right. I agree.
Well, very good. Well, Ludmila, this has been fantastic. Is there anything else that you would like to add, that you really want listeners to take home to know more about corn, or any more, where they can find more information on some of this work that you've done?
Well, I appreciate everybody that is listening to this podcast. I can think of something that we haven't covered right now, but if anybody has any questions, they can reach out to me. And we have some reports about our studies in the Cattlemen's Day report that I believe it's a good resource for people to look for. And they can also, as I said, come talk to me.
It's time for our famous 3.
Your ag business didn't stall on the market. It stalled because everything roots through you. Pricing, hiring, the angry account. You're not leading the company, you're refereeing it. The Owner's Box is a peer group of 8 to 10 agribusiness owners with one agenda: get you out of daily operations and into the owner's seat. Monthly working sessions, real decisions, real commitments. Built by Wisenetics, the #1 podcast network in animal protein. Apply for Cohort 1 at the Owner's Box. Seats close when the room is full.
Absolutely. Now, Ludmila, with all of our guests, I can't let you go just yet. We've had a good conversation about corn processing, and some of the newer hybrids that are helping with cattle feeding and improving efficiency. But I really, with the Beef Podcast Show and everybody that listens in, I think this is a valuable component of this podcast, that we ask all of our guests 3 questions. to help both help people learn more about you, but also kind of where you find information and kind of where you see yourself in the industry. So number one, what is your go-to cattle related resource? If you're going to go find information, how do you find information for the cattle industry?
So I read scientific articles, and I often rely on the Beef Cattle NRC. I also like to read magazines like the Beef Magazine, Feedstuffs, and also some Brazilian magazines to try to keep up to date, because it's been a while. I'm living here in the US, and sometimes I feel that I'm getting too far from that industry. But mostly of the time I read scientific articles.
And we all have to stay up to date with everything. So it's good to hear that, even postdoc researcher, you still have to keep up to date with what's going on a daily basis. And I really appreciate that. Now, outside of agriculture, outside the cattle industry, what are you reading? What are you listening to? What are you diving into outside of the cattle industry?
So personally, I like to watch TV shows whenever I can. But what I want to share here with you today, this is maybe a junction of my professional and personal resource, which is a book called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. And I wanted to read that book because I read that it talked about communication in different cultures. And I was like, well, I think that would be great for me to understand a little bit better how the U.S. communicate. And but also, not only because I'm a foreigner here in the U.S., but we lived in an increasingly globalized world. We must know how to communicate. But also one thing very interesting, when I just started reading the book, I realized that that book, I'm not going to read it to learn how people communicate. I'm reading it to learn how I communicate and my culture communicate. And that wasn't something actually that I thought would happen. And also, this book keeps reminding me that good communication is not good speaking, but is good listening.
Nope, that's a key component, is making sure that we're hearing each other out. And one great thing about our cattle industry is I've had the opportunity, as well as you have, worked with people all over the world. One good thing about the cattle industry, if it's easy to speak cow. If we all are talking about cattle production and beef production, it doesn't matter if we have a language barrier. We can still communicate because we all speak cow. So
that's so true. Yes.
That's the way I joke about it. So third and final question that I want to bring up, you've been in the industry for a while now. You've been able to see different universities interact with people in industry. From your perspective, what makes a agricultural or a feedlot nutrition industry, what makes a good leader and a good mentor? What traits do you look for whenever you're going to see a good leader or a mentor?
Yes, I could list a few characteristics that I personally care for, and I would reach out to those people. But in general, I feel that successful leaders, what everybody considers a successful leader, is a person that is creative and respectful. And that's what I look for in a leader. Maybe that's because I want to become one of that person.
Yeah. Well, and so a lot of times we surround ourselves with people that we want to be if we want to elevate ourselves. So no, that's great advice for the listeners. With that, Ludmila, thank you very much for joining us on the Beef Podcast Show. This has been fantastic. So again, this our discussion on corn processing, some of the newer corn hybrids with amylase corn. This has been Dr. Ludmila Monteiro, a postdoc at Kansas State University. And again, as a reminder, I'm Dr. AJ Tarpoff with the Beef Podcast Show, brought to you by Wisenetics. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It was a nice conversation, and I hope that the audience likes to like to listen to that conversation.
No, I'm sure they're going to pick up some really valuable information. Thank you for coming on today.